roguelikes. Those are games like Rogue and roguelites. Those are also games like Rogue.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of a little thing I'm calling Rogue-lite Round Up, which is a show where we investigate a handful of roguelikes or roguelites and talk about each of them in turn. Typically, I try to spend anywhere from an hour to 5 hours on these games, depending on how much fun I'm having with them and how much I feel like you need to play the game in order to understand the full experience. For this episode, I will be covering Immortal Redneck, Gloom, and Okhlos Omega. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Immortal Redneck is a roguelite boomer shooter or Doom clone, where you play as a mummy who's also a redneck for some reason and is also going through a pyramid for some reason. I'm sure that doesn't matter very much. The gameplay itself is fun and definitely follows in the style of a boomer shooter, which is to say, fast-paced gunplay focused on small arena encounters where you're not only killing enemies but also avoiding trap hazards and traversing level geometry. As you kill enemies, not only do you pick up ammo as a resource for your various guns, but you also collect gold that will come with you into the beginning of the next run each time. At the beginning of each run, you visit a skill tree that you can unlock modules on with various amounts of gold that you've spent. Similar to something like Rogue Legacy, as you spend more gold in the skill tree, more modules increase in price. These are things that can be as simple as increasing gun damage or reload speed or ammo capacity to unlocking additional classes and loadouts for subsequent playthroughs. You can also unlock a shop that will allow you to enter runs with passive buff items. Initially, I kind of bumped off this game. I felt like the level design was a little bit more complex than I wanted, and that the progress was hard to make early on. However, as I played it more and more, I really fell into a groove and started to enjoy it quite a bit. One of the things that I like is that all of the classes or loadouts that you can choose at the beginning of the game really feel pretty varied, and they have interesting access to weapons and suggest specific play styles. In this game, passive buffs come in the form of scrolls that you can pick up off of dead enemies or sometimes find in treasure chests. However, sprinkled in among the positive buffs are also debuff abilities that you can possibly pick up on accident. There's no way to tell what something is until you pick it up, so there's always a little bit of a risk-reward involved. I think my main criticism overall of this game is that the level design is not great. The way that the game procedurally generates each level of the pyramid is obviously in blocks of pre-generated rooms. These are populated uniquely each time with a different assortment of enemies, but once you've done a couple of runs through the game, you'll start to notice a lot of familiar geometry. I don't know if that's necessarily a positive or a negative thing for the game, but it is something I noticed. And actually, in general, I find that each floor on the pyramid is a little bit longer or bigger than I would like. Generally speaking, in a roguelike game that is floor-based, I want those encounters and levels to be much more smaller and have a wider variety of encounters. Something like Gungeon does a really good job of this, and I never felt like I was moving into levels in Gungeon where there just wasn't anything, whereas I could definitely tell a couple of times moving into levels in Immortal Redneck that I had come into a room that might have a treasure chest but just didn't this time, and because of that, there was no real interesting reward for getting in there. Overall, I think Immortal Redneck is a really cool game and a pretty interesting idea. Maybe not quite engaging enough for me to make it all the way through a successful run, but still a fun way to divert yourself, especially if you only have a little bit of time to kill. It's fun to just drop in and do a quick run and see what you can get. I would say that especially if you are into fast-paced first-person shooters like Doom clones or boomer shooters, this might be a game to check out if you didn't already know about it. Gloom is a side-scrolling roguelike in the style of Salt and Sanctuary, but also, on top of that, a roguelike. At the beginning of each run, you're dropped into a hub area where you can interact with NPCs, turn in tokens to give you weapons or items on the subsequent run, and then you get into the level. Levels themselves are comprised of a variety of screens of enemies, with a free passive item room mixed in there, with the possibility of running across an altar room, which allows you to do a short combat in exchange for a free passive item, as well as a couple of different shops where you can turn in gold to buy items or passive items. In terms of combat, the setup is pretty close to a Souls game, or more specifically Bloodborne, where you have your basic attack combo, you can jump, dodge roll, and you also have a ranged weapon that costs bullets. There's also a block or parry system which costs bullets to use as well. Most enemies when killed will drop both gold and bullets, but you still have to be careful to manage your resources well. First and foremost, one of the things that stands out to me is how many mechanics this game is juggling at the same time, and how I think that detracts from the overall experience. This game hews so closely to the Souls formula that it also includes RPG stats and weapons that scale with those stats. However, the only way to affect those stats is by picking up passive items. The only way that you're going to pick those up is either by random chance, or if you can happen to buy them in a store. But since weapon scaling is also tied to stats, you could end up getting a weapon that you want to use, but you don't have the stats to use it, and it could negatively affect your run. One of the things that I really appreciate about this game, however, is that at any point in the game, you can pull up a list of all of the passive items and weapons that you've encountered in the game so far and see what they do for you. This means that as long as you've picked up an item once, you can look at its info in the Necronomicon and see if you'd like to pick it up again. This stands in opposition to something like Isaac, where every time you're picking up an item, you have to memorize what that item does for you to know if it's going to be useful or not. I always appreciate roguelikes that give you more information to make choices based on, instead of it being more based on you memorizing the game. In general, I find that the weapon variety is pretty good here. There is an interesting mix of melee weapons as well as ranged weapons, and although I generally found some to be better than others, it was always interesting to pick up a new one and play around with it, provided that you had the right stats to use it accurately. The other thing I'll say about this game is it is really visually impressive. I think going with the Limbo style duochrome sort of atmosphere really lends a gloomy feel and look to the game that works well. Also, they do a good job of making the visuals fairly clear while sticking to 2 or 3 colors without it getting muddy or confusing. Personally, for myself, I don't think I'll ever go back to Gloom. I think I've played it enough times to get a feel for the game and find that I don't really find it completely satisfying. It is really impressive as the output of a single person, but for me personally, I couldn't recommend it. Okhlos Omega is a highly unique action roguelike. This isn't really like any of the other games that I've played before, especially in the roguelike genre. The way it works is you control an individual character, a philosopher, who incites rebellion among the people that he's with. When you move around and touch dormant NPCs, you will recruit them to your cause as long as they aren't in excess of your rebellion cap. You move your individual philosopher around directly and then direct the mob around by moving the mouse cursor and clicking down to order them to attack things. In true angry mob fashion, almost everything is breakable in this game, be it buildings, enemies, different props, or things in the background. Mobs themselves are made up of different types of villagers. different classes of villagers can do different things or interact differently. Things like citizens are your base class, there are slaves which can carry items to be deployed when you choose, and things like defenders and warriors who are better at attacking or withstanding damage, respectively. Levels themselves are made up of 3 or 4 different stages where they are wide open maps where the objective is to clear all the enemies out of the map before you proceed to the next map. In between each stage, there's a stall where you will be given the option to trade a certain amount of villagers for different types of villagers or special hero units that have unique abilities like increasing your riot cap, doing special area of effect attacks, or healing or buffing units as they go along. At the end of each level, you have a big showdown with a Greek god who is the boss of that stage. Most of the stages have a variety of either 2 or 3 bosses that can show up there each time. Not only do you have to manage what your riot is doing at any given time, but you also have to make sure you keep your philosopher out of harm's way as well. This game also has kind of an arcade feel to the play of it, where you have extra lives in the amount of philosophers that are in your group. When the last philosopher dies off, then you lose the game and have to start over. This is another game where it feels like meta progression is hard to come by. You usually, if you recruit new heroes into your party, you have a chance of unlocking them for subsequent runs, as well as doing certain objectives or completing side missions will allow you to unlock special rabble-rousers who will come with you on your next run through. But overall, I didn't feel like one run was particularly different than the next in terms of how I started. I really love the art and music in this game, however. The art itself is a cool sort of pixelated voxel style that reminds me of 3D Dot Heroes or even something like Minecraft. And the music as well is very neat and feels like a halfway mark between sort of period piece and techno dance. It's very enjoyable. I think in general where this game falls down for me is in the control of it. It's got a really interesting idea and a unique premise for sure, but the actual lack of control that you have over the mob and the way that your mob functions really became frustrating to me over a long time. I often felt like I was getting to bosses and I didn't really know how to deal with them, or running into enemy encounters and I would just get completely wiped out. Obviously that is part of the purpose of the game, to simulate this sort of uncontrollable mob mentality, but while it's a cool idea, I just don't think it really landed. Overall, I would encourage people to look at this game, maybe if it's on sale, because it really is interesting and it is fun to it is another game that's fun to just drop into and like play a run if you have just a little bit of extra time, but not something that I could see myself going back to over and over again. As always, thank you for joining me for another video. I hope you found this fun and informative. If you enjoyed what you saw here, it is immensely helpful if you engage with the video, either by liking or commenting or subscribing. I'm trying to put out videos at least twice a month. We'll see if that actually happens, but it is my goal. And until next time, I love you all, and I hope you're doing well.